The air in the upper corridors of the Senate spire was a testament to engineered perfection, cool, sterile, and tasting faintly of ozone and recycled water. It was an atmosphere designed to preclude emotion, to scrub the messy, organic variables from the calculus of governance. Kalen moved through it like a ghost, his presence a carefully curated study in neutrality. His suit, the regulation grey of a junior delegate's aide, was tailored to suppress the lines of his body, to render him forgettable. His scent blocker patch, a small translucent square at the base of his neck, worked tirelessly to erase his biological signature, rendering him a nullity in a world governed by scent and status. He was a function, not a person, a variable, not a man. This was the discipline that had allowed him to survive, to climb this high in a system built to keep him at the bottom. The Sentience and Sovereignty Act was 3 days from the floor vote, and the spire thrummed with a tension that even the climate control systems could not entirely dissipate. It was a low, subsonic hum of anxiety and ambition, a frequency Kalen felt in his bones. The act proposed the unthinkable, the dissolution of the Alpha-Omega bonding protocols, the legal recognition of Omegas as fully autonomous citizens, no longer subject to the biological and political subjugation of a mark. It was freedom, codified in legislative text, and it was terrifyingly close to passing. His focus was on the datapad in his hand, the shifting columns of projected votes, a fragile architecture of hope. Delegate Thorne, his superior, was a key proponent of the bill, and Kalen's research had been instrumental in swaying the undecideds. He had become an expert in the art of disappearance, of making his contributions felt without being seen. An Omega arguing for his own emancipation was a liability, a display of the very emotional bias the opposition claimed made them unfit for self-governance. So he worked in the shadows, his arguments laundered through Thorne's calm, beta sensibility. He could feel the eyes on him as he walked, the subtle shifts in posture from the Alpha guards, the way their gaze lingered for a microsecond too long. They could not smell him, but they knew what he was. His designation was in his file, a single damning letter that defined his existence. He kept his own eyes down, his expression a mask of placid efficiency. He was not a cause, he was not a symbol, he was an aide delivering a report. That was all. The door to the Alpha Caucus chambers was a monolithic slab of obsidian composite, a void in the white corridor. It slid open with a whisper, revealing the antechamber, a space that felt colder than the hallway. And there, standing by the vast armor-glass window that overlooked the sprawling, geometric perfection of the Capitol, was Senator Lysander Rask. Kalen's breath caught, a tiny, involuntary betrayal. Rask was the architect of the opposition, the immovable object against which their fragile hope was set to break. He was the embodiment of the old guard, of the philosophy of order through control. He had not been expected here. He was supposed to be in a committee meeting on the lower levels. The senator turned, his movements economical and precise. He was a man carved from ice and iron, his features sharp, his eyes the color of a winter sky. There was a stillness about him that was more intimidating than any overt display of power. It was the stillness of absolute confidence, of a predator that knows its prey has no escape. The air shifted, the neutral scent of the room becoming charged with the senator's presence, a clean, cold scent like mountain air and ozone, the unmistakable signature of a dominant alpha. Even through his blocker, Kalen felt it as a physical pressure. Delegate Thorn is not present, Kalen said, his voice perfectly level, a product of years of practice. He held the datapad out slightly, a shield. I was instructed to leave the updated projections for him. Rask did not look at the datapad. His gaze was fixed on Kalen, analytical and unnervingly direct. It felt less like he was being seen and more like he was being scanned, his data processed and filed. "I am aware," the senator said. His voice was a low baritone, calm and measured, each word a carefully placed stone in a wall of authority. "I dismissed him. I wished to speak with you." The statement was a quiet detonation in the room. Kalen's meticulously constructed composure threatened to fracture. There was no reason for a man of Rask's stature to speak to him. He was infrastructure, a tool. One did not speak to the tool. One spoke to the hand that wielded it. "Senator," Kalen managed, his throat tight, "I am merely an aide. My knowledge of the act is purely statistical. Delegate Thorn is the one you should—" "I am not interested in your statistics, Kalen," Rask interrupted, the use of his first name a shocking intimacy, a weaponized familiarity. He took a step forward, and the pressure in the air intensified. "I am interested in your function. You are the emotional core of Thorn's argument, are you not? The ghostwriter of his passionate appeals. Your fingerprints are all over the bill's compassionate clauses, the ones designed to sway the sentimental." Kalen's blood ran cold. He had been so careful. To be seen, to be identified, was to be neutralized. "I only compile data, Senator." Rask smiled, a minute, chilling curve of his lips. "Do not insult my intelligence. I have read your file. I know your designation. I know the Academy reports that praised your logic but warned of your latent emotionalism. You believe this bill will save you. You believe it will create a world where you are not seen as a liability." He was closer now, his shadow falling over Kalen. The sterile air was thick with his scent, a clean, sharp fragrance that was beginning to bypass the blocker's chemical defenses, making the fine hairs on Kalen's arms stand on end. "It will not," Rask continued, his voice dropping lower, a conspiratorial murmur that felt more threatening than a shout. "It will create chaos. It will unravel a century of stability. Your nature, the nature this bill seeks to unleash, is a force of entropy. It requires structure. It requires control." Kalen stood his ground, his body rigid. This was a test, an intimidation tactic. He would not break. "My nature," he said, the words tasting like glass, "is not a matter for political debate." For the first time, a flicker of something unreadable crossed the senator's face. It wasn't anger. It was something closer to clinical curiosity. "There you see," he said softly. "You believe that. You believe you are an individual, separate from the system, but you are a component of it. We all are. And some components must be managed for the good of the whole machine." He reached out, not quickly, but with a deliberate slowness that was terrifying. Kalen flinched, a small, reflexive movement he instantly hated himself for. Rask's fingers brushed against the skin just below his ear, near the scent gland. The touch was cool, almost impersonal, yet it sent a jolt of pure panic through Kalen's system. "The vote will be close," Rask said, his gaze locked on Kalen's, his thumb tracing a slow line along his jaw. "Too close. A matter of a single, wavering vote, perhaps. The balance must be tipped. An object lesson is required to remind the sentimentalists of the stakes, to remind them of the order of things." Kalen's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the silent room. He tried to pull back, but Rask's other hand came up to grip his shoulder, a hold of effortless strength. "Do not be alarmed," the senator murmured, his voice a strange, hypnotic calm against Kalen's rising terror. "This is not personal. This is not an act of passion or malice." His head dipped lower, his breath warm against Kalen's neck. The scent blocker was failing, overwhelmed by the proximity of such a potent alpha. Kalen's own scent, a faint trace of rain-soaked earth, and something sweeter, something he had suppressed for years, was beginning to leak into the air. Rask inhaled, a slow, deliberate intake of breath, and his eyes darkened. "This is strictly political." And then his teeth sank into the soft flesh above Kalen's collarbone. The pain was a starburst, white-hot and absolute. It ripped a strangled cry from his throat, a sound of pure animal shock. It was not a savage, tearing bite, but a deep, unyielding pressure, a claim, a mark. The world dissolved into a dizzying vortex of sensation. The scent blocker failed completely, and a flood of pheromones, both his and Rask's, saturated the air. The senator's cold, clean scent of ozone and mountain air fused with his own, a biological declaration of ownership that burned through his veins like a brand. Through the haze of pain, he felt a strange, invasive connection snap into place, a psychic resonance, a thin, silver cord tying his consciousness to the man who was marking him. He could feel a distant echo of Rask's own state, a cold, focused intentionality, a profound and unshakable sense of control. Rask pulled back, his lips stained with a trace of Kalen's blood. He looked at the fresh mark, a perfect crimson crescent on Kalen's pale skin, with an expression of detached satisfaction, like an artist appraising his work. Kalen stumbled back, his hand flying to his neck, his legs trembling. The pain was already subsiding, replaced by a deep, resonant thrumming that seemed to emanate from the mark itself, a pulse that matched the beating of his own terrified heart. The room spun. The air, once sterile, was now irrevocably tainted, thick with the scent of their mingled biology. Rask straightened his suit jacket, his composure absolute. He was once again the calm, calculating statesman. "The mark will be registered in the public record within the hour," he stated, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Your vote, the one you ghost wrote for Thorn, has just been neutralized. An Omega marked by the chief opponent of the bill is not a sympathetic figure. He is a hypocrite, or worse, a victim who proves the necessity of the very system he sought to dismantle." He looked at Kalen, who was leaning against the wall for support, his mind reeling, his world shattered. There was no pity in the senator's eyes, only the cold, clear light of political victory. "As I said," Rask repeated, turning to leave. "Strictly political." The obsidian door whispered shut, leaving Kalen alone in the sudden, deafening silence, the ghost of Rask's scent clinging to him like a shroud, and the fresh, burning reality of the mark a permanent stain on his skin and his soul. He was no longer a variable. He was a resolved equation. The world did not come back into focus slowly. It slammed into him, a cacophony of amplified sensation. The hum of the Spire's life support systems, once a background drone, was now a roaring engine in his ears. The cool, recycled air felt abrasive against his skin, each particle a tiny needle prick. The light from the window was a physical blow, fracturing into 1,000 blinding shards against his retinas. He slid down the wall, his limbs refusing to hold him, his body a stranger to him. His hand was still pressed to his neck, to the source of the thrumming heat that radiated through his entire being. The pain had receded into a dull, insistent ache, but the violation was a fresh, open wound in his mind. He was marked. The word was a death sentence. It was the end of his autonomy, the end of the carefully constructed identity he had spent his life building. He was no longer Kalen, the brilliant analyst, the quiet strategist. He was Kalen, the property of Senator Lysander Rask. A tremor racked his body, a violent, uncontrollable shudder of shock and revulsion. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the image of Rask's face was burned onto the inside of his eyelids. The cold curiosity, the detached satisfaction. This is strictly political. The phrase was a mockery, a shard of ice in his heart. How could an act so intimate, so profoundly biological, be political? It was a rewriting of his very cells, a branding of his soul, and it had been done with the same impersonal calculation as signing a piece of legislation. A new sensation began to bleed through the sensory overload. It was a faint, alien awareness at the edge of his consciousness, a thin, silver thread of connection. He could feel something, a distant presence, a cool, unshakable calm that was not his own. It was Rask. The bond, the psychic leash forged by the mark, was already active. It was a one-way mirror. He could feel the distant echo of the senator's emotional state, a vast and placid ocean of control, while he himself was a storm of panic and despair. He felt infinitesimally small, a frantic moth pinned to a board. He had to get out. He couldn't stay here, in this room that now smelled of his own subjugation. Using the wall for support, he pushed himself to his feet. His reflection in the dark gleam of the obsidian door was a distorted, wavering effigy of the man who had walked in minutes before. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a terror he had never known. And there, stark against the skin above the collar of his grey suit, was the mark. It was already beginning to bruise. The perfect crescent of teeth marks a deep, violent purple against the inflamed red of his skin. It was a flag planted on conquered territory, a declaration. He fumbled with the collar of his shirt, trying to pull it up to hide the obscene brand. But the fabric was too soft, the cut too precise. It was visible. It was meant to be visible. He stumbled out of the antechamber, into the white, sterile corridor. The guards posted there, the same guards who had watched him with casual disdain on his way in, now stared at him with a mixture of shock and a new, predatory interest. Their alpha senses, far more acute than a beta's, would be screaming at them. The air around him was saturated with the scent of a newly marked Omega, a potent cocktail of distress pheromones irrevocably mingled with the dominant signature of Senator Rask. He was a walking, breathing scandal. He lowered his head, his hair falling over his face, and walked. Each step was an effort of will. He could feel the stares like physical touches, could hear the whispers that started the moment he passed. The spire, once a place of anonymous function, was now a gallery, and he was the exhibit. He needed to get back to his apartment, to the small, soundproofed box that was the only place he felt a semblance of safety. The journey through the pristine, ordered halls of the Senate spire was a blur of averted eyes and sudden, sharp glances. Aides and delegates he had worked with for years now looked at him as if he were a ghost, or worse, a contagion. He saw Delegate Thorne down a long corridor, his face pale with shock. Thorne met his eyes for a fraction of a second before looking away, his expression a complicated knot of pity and political calculation. Kalen knew what that look meant. The cause was compromised. The living symbol of their fight for freedom was now wearing the brand of their greatest enemy. The hope they had so carefully nurtured was poisoned. By the time he reached the transit station, the news had already spread through the building's internal comms. The public registry had been updated. It was official. His datapad, forgotten in his pocket, buzzed incessantly. Messages of confusion, of accusation, of hollow sympathy. He ignored them all. The transit car was a sterile pod, gliding silently through the city's circulatory system. He stared at his reflection in the polished plasteel wall. The man looking back at him was a ruin. The quiet confidence, the rigid control, all of it was gone, stripped away. In its place was a raw, exposed vulnerability. He could feel the bond to Rask as a constant, low hum in the back of his mind. It was a leash, and he could feel the holder of it moving through the city, a calm, steady presence miles away, utterly unaffected by the chaos he had wrought. His apartment was on the 347th floor of a residential spire that overlooked the industrial sector, a privilege afforded by his position. It was small, minimalist, and obsessively clean. It was his sanctuary of control. But as he stepped inside and the door sealed behind him, the control was gone. The silence wasn't calming. It was suffocating. The air, filtered and neutral, felt thin and useless in his lungs. He walked to the bathroom, his movements stiff and robotic. The mirror above the basin showed him the full extent of the damage. The mark was a brutal splash of color on his pale skin, a visceral, ugly truth. He touched it, his fingers tracing the indentations. The skin was hot, swollen. A wave of nausea rolled through him. He ripped off the useless scent blocker patch, the adhesive tearing at his skin, and threw it into the reclamation unit. What was the point of hiding now? He was branded. His scent, his true scent, filled the small room for the first time in years. The smell of rain-soaked earth, of crushed moss, and a faint, sweet note of wild hyacinth. It was the scent of the person he had tried to kill, to bury under layers of discipline and denial. And now, woven through it, was the cold, sharp scent of Rask, ozone and ice, a permanent contamination. He turned on the water, stripping off his suit, his hands shaking so badly he could barely work the fastenings. He stepped into the cleansing unit, the streams of pressurized water and sonic waves beating against his skin. He scrubbed at the mark, his nails digging into the bruised flesh, a desperate, futile attempt to wash it away, to wash him away. But the brand was not on his skin, it was in his blood, in his nerves, in the very architecture of his mind. The water sluiced over him, but it could not clean him. He was stained. Sinking to the floor of the unit, he finally let the facade crumble. A dry, ragged sob escaped his lips, a sound of such profound despair it seemed to tear him apart from the inside. He was not a function. He was not a variable. He was a cage, and the door had just been locked from the outside. Through the psychic tether, a universe away in his own silent, ordered space, Lysander Rask felt a faint, unexpected tremor, a distant echo of shattering despair. He paused, his pen hovering over a legislative brief. He identified the sensation, categorized it as a predictable side effect of the procedure, and dismissed it. It was a variable he had already accounted for. He returned to his work. The machine of state required his attention. The silence of the following hours was a living thing, a presence that pressed in on him from all sides. Kalen sat on the edge of his bed, wrapped in a plain grey robe, and watched the city lights ignite as the permanent, engineered daylight of the capital faded into a managed twilight. He had not moved for what felt like an eternity. His body was a leaden weight, his mind a hollow chamber where the same thoughts echoed relentlessly. Marked, owned, over. The bond to Rask was a constant, a low-frequency hum that had become the new baseline of his existence. It was like living with a ghost in his head, a silent observer whose own emotional state was a vast, unmoving glacier of calm. It was a profound violation, this unwanted intimacy. He could feel the steady, rhythmic pulse of Rask's focus as the senator worked late into the night, the cool detachment as he analyzed reports, the faint, almost imperceptible shift in his biosignature that indicated he was drinking a cup of bitter black tea. It was an excruciating torrent of information about a man he despised, a man who had destroyed him with the casual indifference of a god swatting a fly. His datapad lay dark on the nightstand. He had powered it off after the 100th message had come through. He knew what they would say. He had become a pariah, a traitor, a cautionary tale. In a single, calculated act, Rask had not only secured his political victory, but had also turned Kalen into a weapon against his own people. Any Omega who now argued for the act would be met with the same cynical question. Are you sure you don't just want to be claimed by a powerful alpha? The argument of sentience had been reframed as a lie, a thin veil for biological desire. It was a masterful, cruel stroke of political genius. He closed his eyes, and the memory of the bite returned with a visceral clarity. The sharp pressure, the heat of Rask's mouth, the scent of ozone overwhelming his senses. He shuddered, a full-body tremor that started deep in his bones. He had spent his entire adult life building walls, fortifying himself against the very thing that had just happened to him. Since his designation had manifested in adolescence, he had been taught that his Omega nature was a weakness, a vulnerability to be managed, and, if possible, erased. He'd excelled at it. He had muted his scent, suppressed his instincts, and trained his mind to operate with the cold logic of a beta. He had almost believed he had succeeded. He had almost believed he could be more than his biology. Rask had shattered that illusion in seconds. He had reached past all of Kaelin's defenses and put a leash on the very core of his being. The irony was a bitter acid in his throat. He, the architect of the Sentience and Sovereignty Act's most compelling arguments, was now a living testament to its necessity and, simultaneously, the reason for its inevitable failure. He was the problem and the proof all at once. A flicker of something new pierced through the fog of his despair, a hot, sharp emotion that felt almost foreign. It was anger, a deep, cold rage that began to smolder in the pit of his stomach. Rask had called him a variable, a component in a machine. He had stripped him of his humanity and reduced him to a strategic move on a political chessboard, strictly political. The senator believed he had won. He believed he had neutralized the threat, resolved the equation. He had made one critical miscalculation. He had assumed Kaelin would break. He had assumed he would accept his fate as a victim, a symbol of Omega frailty. He had not accounted for defiance. Slowly, Kaelin stood up. He walked to the small kitchenette and poured a glass of water, his movements becoming more deliberate, less shaken. He drank, the cool liquid, a small anchor in the storm of his thoughts. He looked at his reflection in the dark screen of the main terminal. The face was still pale, the eyes still haunted, but a new light was kindling in their depths, a hard, dangerous glint. Rask had created a bond between them, a conduit. The senator intended it as a chain, a means of control, but a conduit works both ways. Kalen could feel Rask's calm, his focus, his unyielding control. What would happen if something were to disrupt that calm? What would happen if the component began to fight back against the machine? He was marked. He was bonded. These were facts he could not change. But he could change what they meant. He could refuse to be a symbol of defeat. He could instead become a symbol of rebellion. The vote was in 2 days. He had been neutralized as a political asset. He was no longer a sympathetic figure. Good. He didn't need sympathy. He needed a weapon. And Senator Rask, in his infinite, arrogant wisdom, had just handed him one. He had tied their fates together. Kalen would not be dragged down alone. He would become the chaos the senator feared. He would take Rask's perfect, ordered world, and he would set it on fire, using the very bond the man had forced upon him as the fuse. The rage was a clean, purifying flame, burning away the despair, leaving behind a core of diamond-hard resolve. He was not an equation to be solved. He was not a component to be managed. He was a man, and he would not be erased. Across the city, in the sterile silence of his penthouse office, Senator Rask felt another tremor through the bond. This one was different. It was not the shattering of despair. It was the sharp, focused pulse of pure, unadulterated fury. It was so potent, so unexpected, that it made him pause again, his hand tightening on the stylus he was holding. He frowned. This was an anomaly. An emotional spike of this magnitude was inefficient, illogical, a waste of energy. He catalogued it as a predictable, albeit intense, stage of grief and resistance. The subject would acclimate in time. All Omegas did. The system was designed for it. The system was perfect. He returned to his work, but for the first time that night, he found his concentration wavering. The echo of that cold, sharp anger lingered at the edge of his perception, a single, discordant note in the symphony of his control. The next morning, Kalen woke to a world that was both the same and irrevocably different. The engineered sunlight streamed through his window. The air was the same temperature. The sounds of the city were the same distant hum. But within him, the landscape had been redrawn. The bond to Senator Rask was the first thing he was aware of, a permanent feature of his consciousness, like a new limb he didn't know how to control. Through it, he could feel the senator waking in his own stark, minimalist apartment across the city. A slow, controlled rise from slumber into immediate, focused consciousness. There was no grogginess, no soft transition. One moment he was asleep. The next, he was awake and alert. It was the waking of a machine. Kalen sat up, the grey robe falling from his shoulders, and the faint, persistent ache from the mark reminded him of the previous day's reality. He didn't look at it. He didn't need to. He could feel it, a focal point of heat and alien energy on his skin. He rose and began his morning routine, but with a new, deliberate purpose. He did not power on his datapad. He did not check the news feeds. He did not need to see the political fallout. He could infer it from the silence of his allies and the triumphant quiet from the opposition. Today was not about politics. It was about understanding the weapon. He closed his eyes and focused inward, not on his own turmoil, but on the thin, silver thread that connected him to Rask. At first, it was like listening to a conversation in a distant room. Faint, muffled, indistinct. He could feel the broad strokes of the senator's morning, the sensation of a cold shower, the taste of black tea, the texture of the crisp senatorial uniform against his skin. It was a disorienting, invasive intimacy. He pushed past the surface-level sensations, trying to find the source, the core of the man. He was met with a wall, a fortress of pure, unadulterated control. Rask's mind was a meticulously organized archive, his emotions filed away, his thoughts precise and linear. There was no chaos, no stray feelings, no wasted energy. It was magnificent and terrifying. But Kalen had spent his life analyzing systems, looking for weaknesses, for hairline fractures. He focused on the bond, not as a passive receiver, but as an active participant. He pushed a flicker of his own anger along the psychic tether, a small, sharp probe of emotion. For a moment, nothing happened. Then he felt a response from the senator's end, not an emotion, but a cognitive action. It was a flicker of awareness, a mental process that identified the incoming emotional signal, analyzed it, categorized it as hostile, irrelevant, and then filed it away. The efficiency of the dismissal was chilling. It was like throwing a rock into the ocean. Rask didn't suppress the emotion. He simply processed it into nothing. A cold knot of frustration tightened in Kalen's stomach. How could he fight a man who wasn't even fighting back? A man who treated genuine human emotion as junk data to be purged from the system. He was trying to start a fire on a block of ice. He changed his tactic. Anger was a direct assault, and Rask's defenses were absolute. So he wouldn't use anger. He would use something else. He reached for a memory, a feeling Rask would have no category for. He thought of his mother, years ago, before she had been sent to a compliance facility. He remembered the scent of her, the warmth of her hand, the sound of her humming a lullaby that was centuries old. He remembered the feeling of unconditional love, of perfect, selfless safety. It was a feeling from a world before designations, before the spire, before the cold, sterile order of their society. It was a feeling of pure, organic humanity. He took that feeling, that memory, and he didn't push it at Rask. He simply held it, letting it fill his own consciousness, and allowed the resonance to travel down the bond, a soft, warm current in the cold, psychic space between them. Across the city, Senator Lysander Rask was in a secure, soundproofed vehicle, reviewing the final schedule for the floor vote. His mind was clear, his focus absolute. The opposition was in disarray. The wavering votes had solidified in his favor. The passage of the Sentience and Sovereignty Act was now a statistical improbability. His strategy had been a success. Then he felt it. It was not a sharp spike of anger like before. It was a slow, pervasive warmth that seeped into the edges of his consciousness. It was an echo of a feeling so alien to his own experience that his mind struggled to categorize it. It was illogical, inefficient. It served no purpose. It felt gentle. And for the first time in his adult life, Lysander Rask was distracted. He lowered his datapad, his brow furrowing in a rare expression of confusion. The feeling was not his own, but it was inside his head, a Kitzar, ghost of a memory that did not belong to him. It was the scent of baked bread, the feeling of a soft hand, the sound of a woman humming. It was utterly meaningless, and yet it was profoundly unsettling. He tried to do what he had done with the anger, to identify, categorize, and dismiss. But this feeling resisted. It didn't fight back. It simply was. It was like trying to file away the sunlight. he felt a flicker of something he could only identify as irritation. This was an unforeseen complication of the bond, an acceptable one, but a complication nonetheless. The Omega was more resilient than his file suggested. The emotional transmissions were a primitive, desperate form of attack. He would have to fortify his mental defenses. He closed his eyes, focusing his will, reinforcing the walls of his control, pushing the unwanted warmth out. It receded, but a trace of it lingered, like the ghost of a fragrance he couldn't identify. The experience left him with a strange, unpleasant sensation, a hairline crack in his perfect internal order. It was the first time he had ever felt anything that he could not immediately understand and control. The feeling was vulnerability, and he despised it. Kalen felt the walls go up. He felt the soft warmth of his memory being pushed back, rejected by the sheer force of Rask's will. But he also felt that flicker of confusion, that microsecond of disruption before the defenses were engaged. It was a victory, a small one, but a victory nonetheless. He had found a crack. He had found a language the senator did not speak. He spent the rest of the day in quiet meditation, not wallowing in his fate, but exploring the bond. He tested it, sending different emotions, different memories, fear, joy, a profound, aching sadness he felt when looking at old photographs. Each time, Rask's defenses would slam down, but not before a trace of the feeling got through, a tiny drop of ink in a vast glass of water. Kalen was learning. He was calibrating his weapon. Rask had intended the mark to be a public spectacle, a tool to shame and silence him. But the true battle would not be fought in the Senate chamber or in the court of public opinion. It would be fought here, in the silent, invisible space between their two minds. The vote was tomorrow. Rask would walk onto the Senate floor confident in his victory, believing his world was still in perfect order. He would not realize that the foundations of his fortress were already being eroded from within. Kalen opened his eyes. He felt a grim, cold sense of purpose settle over him. He had been a ghost in the machine for years. Now, he would become the machine's ghost. He would haunt the man who had tried to erase him. He would use the very chains Rask had forged to pull the senator down into the chaos he so desperately feared. He walked to his closet and pulled out the grey suit he had worn yesterday. The suit of a delegate's aide. The suit of a nullity. He would not wear it. Tomorrow. Tomorrow he would wear no one's colours but his own. Tomorrow he would walk into the lion's den, not as prey, but as the predator no one saw coming. The morning of the vote arrived with a heavy, portentous stillness. Kalen stood before the mirror, not the small one in his bathroom, but the full-length reflective panel in his living area. He was not dressed in the muted grey of an aide. He wore a simple, dark blue tunic and black trousers. The clothing was unadorned, without rank or affiliation. It was the clothing of a private citizen, the clothing of a man. He had spent the night not in sleep, but in a state of deep, focused meditation, his consciousness poised on the edge of the bond. He had felt Rask's dreamless, efficient rest. He had felt the senator's calm, methodical preparation for the day. He felt him now, dressing in his severe, immaculate uniform, his mind already on the legislative floor, running through the final permutations of the vote, certain of the outcome. There was no anxiety, no doubt, only the placid hum of absolute certainty. It was the certainty Kalen intended to shatter. He had not used any scent suppressants. His own natural scent, The fragrance of rain and earth he had hidden for so long filled his apartment. It was a quiet act of self-reclamation. He reached up and touched the mark on his neck. Over the past day, the bruising had deepened to a dark, violent violet, a stark and ugly brand against his skin. He had made no effort to conceal it with makeup or a high collar. It was there for the world to see. But as he looked at it in the mirror, he no longer saw it as a symbol of his shame. He saw it as a key, a gateway, a weapon. He thought of the system that had created this moment, a system that designated people at birth, that valued control over compassion, order over freedom, a system that saw a person like him not as a man, but as a problem to be managed. Senator Rask was not just a man. He was the system's high priest, its most fervent believer. To break the man was to break the ideology. Kalen closed his eyes and reached out through the bond. He didn't send an emotion this time. He sent a question, a simple, silent query projected into the psychic space between them. Why? He felt the instantaneous response from Rask, the mental process of analysis, the categorization of the query as irrelevant, the attempt to dismiss. But the question lingered. It was too simple, too fundamental to be filed away as an emotional attack. Why this control? Why this fear of chaos? What are you so afraid of? He felt a flicker of something sharp and cold from Rask's end. Not confusion this time, annoyance. It was the irritation of a perfect machine encountering a piece of grit in its gears. The senator was in his transport, on his way to the spire. Kalen could feel the hum of the vehicle's engine, see through a ghostly overlay the blur of the city flying past the window. He could feel Rask's will exerting itself, pushing back against the unwanted mental intrusion, reinforcing his psychic shields. Kalen did not fight it. He simply held the question there, a quiet, persistent echo. Why? He opened his eyes and looked at his own reflection. The man in the mirror looked back, his gaze steady. He was afraid. A deep, primal part of him was screaming in terror at what he was about to do. He was about to walk into the heart of the system that had oppressed him his entire life and challenge its most powerful defender on his own ground. But his resolve was stronger than his fear. He had been living as a ghost for years. He was done with being invisible. He was done with being silent. He left his apartment, the doors sealing behind him with a soft hiss. He walked to the transit station, his head held high. He did not shy away from the stares and whispers that followed him. He met them. He let them see him. He let them see the mark. He was no longer hiding. The journey to the Senate spire was a study in social isolation. The transit car remained empty, except for him, other passengers choosing to wait for the next one rather than share the small space. He was a spectacle, a creature of rumor and scandal. He felt their pity, their scorn, their morbid curiosity. He felt it all, and he let it wash over him, a tide of judgment that no longer had the power to harm him. He was focused on a singular point in the distance, the cool, controlled consciousness of Senator Rask, who had just arrived at the spire and was moving towards the Senate chamber, his mind a fortress of conviction. As Kalen entered the spire's grand atrium, a hush fell over the assembled crowd of aides, journalists, and lobbyists. Every head turned, every eye fixed on him, and on the brutal mark so clearly visible on his neck. He ignored them. He was not here for them. He made his way to the public gallery overlooking the Senate floor, his footsteps echoing in the sudden, profound silence. He found a seat in the front row, a position that gave him a clear, unobstructed view of the central podium and, more importantly, of the seat belonging to Senator Lysander Rask. He sat, his back straight, his hands resting calmly in his lap. He was an island of stillness in a sea of frantic, last-minute political maneuvering. Down below, the senators were taking their places. He saw Delegate Thorne, who looked up at the gallery, his face a mask of weary resignation. He saw the allies who had abandoned him, the opponents who now smirked with triumph. And then he saw Rask. The senator entered the chamber with his usual air of unshakable authority. He moved with a grace and precision that was almost inhuman. He did not look up at the gallery. He did not need to. Kalen knew, through the bond, that Rask was acutely aware of his presence. He could feel the senator's mental shields, reinforced and solid. He was a fortress, prepared for a siege. The session was called to order. The preliminary proceedings droned on, a meaningless ritual before the main event. Kalen closed his eyes, shutting out the chamber, the whispers from the gallery, everything. He focused his entire being on the bond, on the single thread that connected him to the man below. He did not send anger or sadness or love. He sent something far more potent. He sent himself. He projected his own raw consciousness down the psychic tether. He sent the memory of the cold antechamber, the terror as Rask approached him. He sent the starburst of pain from the bite, the feeling of his own blood on the senator's lips. He sent the shame of the walk through the corridors, the agony of his isolation, the despair in the cleansing unit. He didn't send them as an attack. He sent them as a shared experience. This is what you did. This is what it felt like. On the Senate floor, Lysander Rask stood to make his final statement against the act. His voice was calm, resonant, filled with the cold, clear logic that had always been his greatest weapon. He spoke of stability, of order, of the dangers of emotionalism in governance. He spoke of the necessity of the bonding protocols to protect society from the entropic nature of Omega biology. He was the perfect statesman, the voice of reason. But inside his mind, a war was raging. Kalen's memories, his feelings, were flooding the pristine chambers of his consciousness. It was a torrent of raw, unfiltered human experience. The pain was not a concept. It was a ghost of sensation on his own skin. The terror was not a statistic. It was a frantic, rabbit-like heartbeat in his own chest. The despair was not a political variable. It was a cold, grey fog clouding his own thoughts. He tried to fight it. He tried to erect his walls, to categorize and dismiss the flood of alien sensation. But it was too much. It was the unfiltered reality of the violence he had committed, a violence he had justified as a political necessity. For the first time, he was being forced to experience the consequence, not just observe the result. His voice, for a fraction of a second, faltered. A single word caught in his throat. No one else would have noticed it, but in a man of his preternatural control, it was a seismic event. Kalen felt it. He felt the crack in the fortress, and he pushed. He did not push with anger. He pushed with a simple, devastating truth. He sent the feeling of his own identity, his own sense of self, his sentience. He projected the quiet dignity of his own existence, the simple, profound desire to be free. I am not a component. I am not a liability. I am a person. Rask's perfectly constructed arguments began to sound hollow, even to himself. He was speaking of omegas as a theoretical concept, a dangerous abstraction to be managed, while the living, breathing reality of one was screaming in his mind. demanding to be acknowledged. He could feel Kalen's life, the years of suppression, the quiet hope, the fierce intelligence, the unyielding will to be seen as more than his designation. He was not looking at data on a screen. He was drowning in the consciousness of the man he had tried to break. He finished his speech, his final words sounding automated, devoid of their usual conviction. He sat down, his face a pale, rigid mask. But inside, his perfect, ordered world was beginning to crumble. The grit was not in the machine. The grit was the machine. The flaw was in the design. The call for the vote began. The roll call started, an alphabetical litany of political fate. The names were called and the votes were cast, lighting up the main holographic display in green for yay, red for nay. The chamber was silent. The only sound the calm, synthesized voice of the clerk and the soft chime of each registered vote. Kalen kept his eyes on Rask. He did not need to see the display. He was watching the only vote that mattered. Through the bond, he could feel the senator's internal state. It was a maelstrom. The fortress of his mind was breached, its walls collapsing under the relentless flood of Kalen's lived experience. The cold logic that had governed Rask's entire life was at war with a new, terrifying force. Empathy. He was feeling for the first time the human cost of his perfect, ordered system. Kalen didn't relent. He kept projecting, not with malice, but with a kind of desperate insistence. He sent the hope he had felt when first reading the draft of the act. He sent the quiet pride of his work with Delegate Thorne. He sent the simple, universal dream of a future where he would be judged not by his biology, but by the content of his character. He was laying his entire soul bare for this one man, his tormentor, his captor, to see. See me. See what you have done. See who I am. The clerk's voice moved through the alphabet. The tally on the board was terrifyingly close, swaying back and forth. The opposition, Rask's faction, was holding strong. The proponents were holding too. It was coming down to the handful of undecideds, the ones Rask's object lesson had been designed to sway. And it had worked. Most of them were voting nay, their faces grim, their glances flickering towards Kalen in the gallery. They saw him not as a man demanding freedom, but as a cautionary tale, a confirmation of the chaos Rask had warned them about. The senator's strategy had been brutally effective. Senator Rask, the clerk's voice intoned, clear and impartial. A profound silence fell over the chamber. Every eye turned to him. This was a formality. His vote was a certainty. He was the leader of the opposition. His red nay would be the final nail in the coffin of the Sentience and Sovereignty Act. Kalen held his breath. He focused all his will, all his pain, all his hope into one final silent plea through the bond. Look at what you've done. Is this the order you want? An order built on this? Lysander Rask did not move. He sat perfectly still, his hands resting on the table before him, his gaze fixed on the empty space ahead. His face was unreadable, a mask of stone. But Kalen could feel the hurricane raging within him. He could feel the foundations of a lifetime of belief being ripped apart. He was a man who had dedicated his life to the idea that emotion was a weakness, that control was paramount, that the system was more important than the individual. And now, the consciousness of a single, broken individual was showing him that his entire philosophy was built on a lie. The system wasn't preventing chaos. It was creating it. It was a machine that fed on human suffering to maintain its own sterile, meaningless order. He had called Kalen a component. But what if the component had a soul? What did that do to the integrity of the machine? Senator Rask, the clerk repeated, a note of gentle insistence in its voice. Your vote. Rask raised his head. His gaze, for the first time, lifted from the floor and swept up to the gallery. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, found Kalen's. And in that moment, across the silent chamber, across the psychic bridge that bound them, they saw each other. Kalen saw not a monster, but a man trapped in a prison of his own making, his face etched with a confusion so profound it looked like pain. And Rask saw Kalen, not the Omega, not the variable, not the political tool. He saw the man in all his defiance, his pain, and his unbreakable dignity. He saw the human soul he had tried to extinguish. He opened his mouth to speak. The word nay was on his lips, the product of a lifetime of conviction. But another word came out, quiet, yet echoing in the stunned silence of the chamber. Abstain. A collective gasp swept through the Senate. Abstain. It was an unthinkable act for a man like Rask, the political equivalent of a priest declaring his atheism at the altar. It was a declaration of failure, of uncertainty, of a complete breakdown of his own rigid ideology. The clerk, after a moment of stunned hesitation, registered the abstention. The vote was no longer a certainty. The final few names were called. The undecideds who were to vote after Rask, seeing the leader of the opposition falter, were thrown into confusion. One of them, a junior senator from a remote district, a woman known for her quiet conscience, changed her vote from nay to yea. It was enough. The final tally appeared on the holographic display. Yea, 51. Nay, 50. Abstain, 1. The Sentience and Sovereignty Act had passed. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then, the chamber erupted. Shouts of triumph from one side, cries of disbelief and outrage from the other. The machine had broken. The world had just tilted on its axis. In the gallery, Kalen felt the strength leave his body. He sagged in his seat, the tension of the last 2 days draining out of him, leaving him hollow and trembling. He had won. They had won. Below, in the chaos, Senator Rask rose to his feet. He did not look at his furious colleagues. He did not look at his triumphant Zhou opponents. He looked once more up at Kalen, his expression a maelstrom of emotions Kalen could now feel through the bond. Confusion, regret, a terrifying, nascent flicker of something that felt like awe. Then he turned and walked out of the chamber, a solitary, rigid figure moving against the tide of history he had just, against all intention, helped to create. The bond between them hummed, no longer a chain of subjugation, but something else entirely. It was a question, a shared moment of terrifying, world-altering transformation. Kalen watched him go, the noise of the celebration around him fading into a distant roar. The system was broken. Freedom had been won, but he was still bound to the man who had, in trying to destroy him, inadvertently become his liberator. The political battle was over. Theirs, he knew, had just begun. The aftermath was a blur of noise and light. The proponents of the act swarmed the gallery, their faces alight with a joy so pure it felt alien to Kalen. Delegate Thorne reached him first, his hand clapping Kalen on the shoulder, his eyes wet with tears. "You did it," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how, but you did it." Kalen could only nod, his throat too tight to form words. He was the center of a storm of celebration, but he felt profoundly, utterly alone. The others saw a political victory. They saw the fall of a tyrant, the dawn of a new era. They did not see the invisible tether that still connected him to the man who had just walked out of the chamber. They did not feel the echo of Rosk's shattering confusion, a psychic resonance that was now a permanent part of Kalen's own mind. He excused himself, slipping away from the jubilant crowd, needing silence, needing space to breathe. He found his way to a deserted observation deck, the armor glass looking out not on the city, but on the endless, engineered grey of the sky. The air here was colder, the silence more profound. He leaned his forehead against the cool glass, the immensity of what had happened finally settling over him. The law was passed. The bonding protocols were abolished. No Omega would ever again be subjected to what he had endured. It was a victory of unimaginable scale, and it had been paid for with his own freedom. He was still marked, still bonded. The new law was not retroactive. His connection to Rask was a fact, a permanent state of being. He had freed his people by enslaving himself to their greatest enemy. The irony was so vast, so bitter, it threatened to suffocate him. He felt a presence behind him and turned. It was Rask. The senator stood in the doorway, his uniform immaculate, his posture as rigid as ever. But his face was a ruin. The mask of cold control was gone, replaced by a raw, naked uncertainty. The winter sky in his eyes was clouded, turbulent. They stood in silence for a long moment. The only sound, the low hum of the spire. The bond between them was a palpable thing in the quiet space, a live wire crackling with unspoken thoughts and volatile emotions. "You were a variable I did not properly account for," Rask said finally. His voice was different. The calm, resonant authority was gone, replaced by a quiet, hollow tone. "I calculated your response based on 1,000 precedents of Omega behavior. Fear, submission, despair. I did not calculate for this." "You calculated for a component," Kalen replied, his own voice steady, though his heart was hammering. "You did not calculate for a person." Rask took a step into the room. "What you did, what you sent to me, it was—" He trailed off, struggling for a word. His vocabulary, so precise and powerful on the Senate floor, was failing him. "It was the truth," Kalen said softly. "A truth your system is designed to ignore." The senator walked slowly to the window, standing a few feet from Kalen. He stared out at the grey, featureless sky. "My entire life has been dedicated to a single principle. That order is the highest good. That the chaos of individual emotion is the greatest threat to civilization. To achieve order, some sacrifices are necessary. The individual must, at times, be subsumed for the good of the whole. And you decided you were the one who got to choose the sacrifices," Kalen stated. It was not an accusation. It was a simple statement of fact. "I believed it was my duty," Rask said. He looked at Kalen, and for the first time, Kalen saw not a politician, not an alpha, but just a man whose entire world had been dismantled in the space of an hour. "When I marked you," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I believed I was performing a necessary, albeit unpleasant, political function, a demonstration of principle. I told myself it was impersonal." "You told me it was strictly political," Kalen corrected him, the words sharp. Rask flinched, a minute, almost imperceptible reaction. "It was a lie," he admitted. "Not to you, to myself. The moment it was done, I felt the connection. I felt your pain. I categorized it as a side effect. I dismissed it, but it did not go away. Nothing you sent me went away. It is all still there. He gestured vaguely at his own head. A new archive, one I cannot seem to organize or delete. Kalen felt a strange, unsettling pang of something that was almost pity. He crushed it. Pity was a luxury he could not afford. The world has changed, Kalen said, turning back to the window. The act has passed. What happens now? I do not know, Rask said, the admission a crack in the very foundation of his being. My faction is in ruins. My political career is likely over. I am untethered. He looked at the mark on Kalen's neck, the brutal violet crescent that he had put there. His expression was a complex mixture of guilt and a strange, terrifying possessiveness. We are untethered, he said, his voice low. Together. The word hung in the air between them. Kalen felt the truth of it in his bones. The world might be free, but he and Rask were in a new kind of prison, one with only 2 inmates. The bond can be legally severed now, Kalen said, testing him. The new laws will allow for it. Rask was silent for a long time. Kalen could feel the conflict within him through the bond, the instinctual alpha possessiveness warring with the dawning, horrified realization of his own monstrosity. Would you want that? Rask asked, his voice strained. It was the most vulnerable question Kalen had ever heard him ask, and he found, to his own astonishment, that he did not have an answer. To sever the bond would be to cut away the man who had violated him, to be free of his presence in his mind. But it would also be to sever the connection that had, in its own twisted way, brought about the liberation of his people. It was a part of him now, the scar, the brand, the psychic tether. They were woven into the fabric of his victory. It was not strictly political, Kalen said, echoing the senator's own words back at him. It was a transformation for both of us. Rask looked away, unable to meet his gaze. The unshakable senator, the master of order, was undone. The system he had championed was broken. The man he had tried to break had broken him instead. The future was a vast, terrifying unknown. But as they stood there in the silent observation deck, 2 men bound by an act of violence and an accident of history, Kalen felt the first fragile tremor of something that was not despair or anger. It was not hope, not yet. It was something quieter, a sense of beginning. The old world had ended. A new one, uncertain and unwritten, was waiting. And they, for better or for worse, would face it together.